Good evening. This is a short video about the Recon role-playing game. Recon was the role-playing game of the Vietnam War and was released in 1982. See, it says right here, the role-playing game of the Vietnam War. It was released in 1982 by a company called RPG Incorporated, Role-Playing Games Incorporated. Also kind of the double meaning of the rocket-propelled grenade launcher. And as you can see, pretty nice looking production. I actually like this illustration on the cover. This was the first printing of the rule book. This was written by a guy named Joe F. Martin, and as far as I know, he wrote all of the supplements for Recon. In its short life, there were 6 products produced for Recon overall. I've got 4 of them here, and we're going to do a little bit of talking about them. But this was the first edition of the rule book. It was a magazine size. Didn't really have a very thick cover. This is almost like a thick magazine, and it's glossy. It wasn't a real sturdy product. I'm not criticizing it. I actually like the cover illustration quite a bit, and you can probably not see it because of my crappy webcam, but this is JFM. I'm wondering if that was indeed Joe F. Martin. There are no art credits anywhere in any of these products that I've seen. On the front cover it says that it was written by Joe F. Martin. It does have a dedication to some people in his life, men and women of the armed forces, and a map of Vietnam in the inside cover, but no art credits in any of this stuff. So this was the first printing of the rule book. Came out in 1982. They actually changed the cover for the second printing. This is the mission director screen, or the referee screen. The referee or DM in Recon is called the mission director. They actually went to this cover, but in a smaller book. So the second printing of the rule book would have been this size, this digest size, and with this cover. I don't have that here to show you, sorry, but hopefully you can visualize it. It looks like they moved to a more standardized kind of design so that everything could be identified as a Recon product. So you had, the mission director screen. This screen was actually packaged with the second printing of the rule book, and then you had a couple of modules that varied in format. This is module 1. Haifong Halo basically looks like a folded up newspaper, but you can see graphically it's easily identified as a Recon product, and same with the second module, Hearts and Minds. So we've got a rule book, we've got a mission director screen, and 2 modules. Other than that, there were 2 more products made for this game. One was Sansucci, or Sansucci, I'm not really sure how it's pronounced, S-U-C-C-I. It was a pack of maps. It was a big map, actually, of a city block, maybe several blocks, from what I understand. I've not actually seen it, just seen some pictures online, and it basically was just floor plans and brief descriptions. The other supplement I have seen, that one is called Sayret, S-A-Y-A-R-E-T. I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced. That is a game using the Recon rules for playing during the Arab-Israeli conflict, I think from 1965 to 1983 is what's covered in the rules. So it uses the same Recon rule set. Recon also did have, it was mainly focused on the Vietnam War, but there were rules for playing mercenaries in this book, so you could take your characters, if they were lucky enough to survive, and they often wouldn't be. You could take those characters beyond the Vietnam War, or even start your game elsewhere if you choose. So I'm going to briefly go through these products. I'm not a professional videographer, as you probably already figured out, so just try to bear with me, okay? Recon was well known for being, I believe, the first game of the Vietnam War. I think it's a pretty interesting game. Oh, that glare. Certainly not perfect, and certainly a product of its time in both theme and design, but I think there are some very cool things about the game. So I'll go over it and try to give a thorough going over, warts and all. The game also I think is a little misunderstood. I see it referred to a lot, the original Recon, and just sorry if I jump around here a bit. This game was actually purchased by Palladium Books and released in the mid-'80s in a somewhat revised format as Revised Recon. There were also there was a supplement for Revised Recon called Advanced Recon that added some more options and also a campaign. I've looked over Revised Recon and Advanced Recon, and basically the core system seems to be pretty much the same with some tweaks. It looks like they tried to make characters a little sturdier so they'd survive longer. As written, the original Recon game is pretty deadly. And then there was yet another version in the 90s called Deluxe Revised Recon that was basically the Advanced Recon and the Revised Recon book just combined. Is all it is. And nothing else has ever come out for the game that I'm aware of. So, but I'm going to talk only about the first edition. I've looked over the second edition and also Deluxe Revised, which is, you know, all the second edition material reprinted, as I said, a little bit, so I can make some comparisons, but this is going to be about the first edition of Recon. I say the game is misunderstood. One thing that I hear, or I shouldn't say hear, but I see people talking about on forums that I've seen the original Recon referred to as a miniatures game. People think it's some kind of a tactical miniatures game. That's not the case. And it even says so right here on the cover, the role-playing game of the Vietnam War. I know that some of the games, especially in the early days, really kind of blurred that line between wargame and role-playing, or really skewed more heavily towards wargaming with some rudimentary rules if they were there at all. But Recon, from the beginning, did have rules that were intended for role-playing rather than tactical gaming. There are some interesting abstractions in the game as well, but I'll get into those more in a minute. But there's definitely a lot of role-playing that goes on here. There's an alignment system, you know, not like in D&Ds, but more along the lines of what type of soldier are you? Are you kind of a gun-happy psychopath? Or are you a guy who's trying to do some good and you know, spread freedom and democracy? Are you somebody who's just trying to get home alive? That kind of thing. So let's talk a little bit about the system. So Recon is interesting to me because it's a military game, but it really defies a lot of the conventions of military games, and especially military games in the 80s, which a lot of the ones I've seen tended to be very rule-heavy and somewhat simulationist, and a lot more kind of realistic in that sense. I have heard people refer to Recon as being gritty and realistic. I don't necessarily get that. I can see gritty because of the tone and subject matter, but realistic, I don't think so. It's pretty abstract and pretty simplistic in a lot of ways. There's not a lot of granularity in the way that different weapons deal damage. So pretty much every weapon in the game has the ability to be deadly. Now some people may say realistic when they mean deadly, and if that's the metric that we're using, then Recon certainly is that. But the overall system itself, unlike a lot of military games, as I said, is pretty simple. So a character is going to have 3 basic characteristics, right? And they are going to be strength, agility, and alertness. These are rolled randomly on a percentile die, okay? Using 2 10-sided dice. Somewhat confusingly, Recon refers to this as 2D100, I think because you're using 2 dice, and because they the number is going to be, you know, 1 to 100. So I've seen some people state that, oh yeah, this is going to give you a number between, you know, say 1 and 100, or 1 and 200 rather, or 2 and 200, sorry. But really it's just percentile dice. Strength, agility, alertness. That's it. You roll those randomly, and you get what you get. There is kind of a mulligan rule in the game. If all of your characteristics add up to less than 100, you can just, the character's 4F in military parlance, unfit for service, and you can roll up another one. Let me assure you that if your character's abilities or attributes all add up to 101, that character is still going to be very crappy. This is a pretty unforgiving game, so if there's any consolation in having these randomly generated stats that can be acceptable but still not be very good, just know that if you roll a crappy character, you're not going to have to live with them for very long, in all likelihood. Plenty of ways to die in this game. I'll get to that more in a minute. So strength is a lot of things in this game. Your strength is your hit points. Okay, and as you get wounded, then you lose strength temporarily, as long as you survive, and then your lowered strength is going to be the basis that you use for all the other things that strength does for you in this game. How much you can carry, movement, climbing, things like that. Agility, most of your hand-to-hand combat, pretty much any weapon or fighting that isn't a firearm is going to be handled through agility. And then you have alertness. You're going to pick your left and right-handed too. There is a hit location chart, and then you pick you roll your alertness. And alertness is going to be for a lot of your technical skills, medical stuff if you're a medic, just different things like that, spotting traps, things of that nature. You also get your height, weight, all that stuff is somewhat randomly rolled. You have a base and then you roll that stuff. You'll pick your ethnicity, whether you're American or some type of indigenous Vietnamese. So you can play Americans, but you can also play Vietnamese. And depending on what type of recon team you're in, and there are a few different types in the book, your team may be mostly Vietnamese people. Some of these modules, or both of the modules I should say, in this one, Haiphong Halo, module number 1, it is generally assumed that the characters are going to be Vietnamese because they're operating behind enemy lines and they need to avoid detection. And in this one, Hearts and Minds, there are also plenty of opportunities to play indigenous Vietnamese people. So. You will pick an MOS, that's your class. Basically they say that in the book, that's your class. So an MOS is going to be anything from heavy weapons operator to a point man to a medic to there are several of them. And your MOS is going to determine a lot of times the skills that are available to you. You will pick a primary MOS and a secondary MOS. Some MOSs, if you have that, there's a list that you can't have 2 of the MOSs from that list because there's a lot of equipment that has to be carried. One is the RTO, which is the radio operator, and then at the heavy weapons expert. So you couldn't carry a big old machine gun and a radio pack, for example. So, and then you will roll randomly to see how many skills you have, and then you are going to basically pick skills from a list. Some skills will be available to your MOS and some will not. Oh, and MOS, by the way, is, I think, military occupational specialty. I've never been in the military. If I get any of this wrong, I apologize. No disrespect intended, and thank you to the men and women of our armed forces. I appreciate what you do. So, most of your weapon skills that are firearms, you're going to roll a base percentage. And then you will base percentage in machine guns, or base percentage in, say, pistols, and then as you select skills, these skills will give you a bonus 5%, whatever, onto that. Each skill slot I think is like a 5% bonus, or most of them are. So the combat system in this is very simple as well. And really the resolution system in general is going to be roll a percentile die against either your strength, agility, or alertness, or a weapon skill. That weapon skill can be modified, of course, by skill slots. Your agility that you're going to roll can be modified by hand-to-hand combat skills, and your alertness will also be modified a lot of times by non-combat skills. So your strength handles your climbing, your hit points, your movement. Agility is going to handle most of your hand-to-hand combat skills, just to recap, and alertness is going to handle a lot of other skills. And that's pretty much it. That's the base system. Roll under. Okay, it's not a rollover system, it's a roll under system. So a higher number, of course, is better. So there are a lot of modifiers that come into play. So modifiers can be If a person's running, you have modifiers for both your position and your enemy's position. So if you're prone, which is one of the better positions, you might get a bonus. But if your enemy's running, then you might have a minus that you have to tack onto that. So while the base system is very simple at its core, there are a lot of modifiers that add up pretty quickly. There are tables. Man, do we have tables in this game. I think there are like 9 pages of tables in this game. Now keep in mind that the entire page count of this game is 44. You got 2 pages of play aids, right? The character sheet, you got a patrol boat here, kind of a diagram, and then some, if you are going to use miniatures for this game, which is recommended, you've got some scaling here for different size of miniatures, and this grid, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, this is going to be for artillery and airstrikes. So 2 pages of play aids, 9 pages of tables, that's 11 pages, so that is going to be 33 pages of rules in this book, and that includes the splash page in the front. You might think that at 33 pages, a game that is supposed to be a complete game would leave a lot of stuff out. And it really doesn't feel that way. Recon feels jam-packed with stuff. The formatting is very dense. It's laid out okay. I mean, this is from the early days of the hobby, and you can really tell. You know, like this table of contents is a bit of a mess. You know, you've got sections, page numbers, but the bubbles and everything are just, it's just weird looking. But there are some paragraphs that, you know, get repeated. Some stuff isn't really laid out that well. You can tell not only that, you know, this was a smaller operation that put this out, but it was from the early days of the hobby. So an example I'll give you of something not being really where it's supposed to be, or where you think it's going to be, is, you know, skills get brought up, like, hey, you get to choose your skills. And then you go through, you know, different kinds of recon teams, the VC, methods of insertion, and then, you know, mercenary stuff, debriefing, you know, all the ins and outs, and then you have your list of your weapons, the different kinds of, you know, I said position was so important, running, standing, kneeling, prone or braced of the marksman and the target, etc., etc. You get into your small arms. This is where they start to talk about your base effectiveness. So, you know, you get your skills, you pick them, but then you don't really figure out how to use them until, you know, quite a ways later. So it is a little confusing in terms of the layout, a little bit of an editorial mess, but still, this thing is just jam-packed. There's not a lot of wasted space. You do have some illustrations. They're pretty good. Again, don't know who did them. I'm assuming it's Joe Martin. They all look like they were done by the same person. But everything here, there's not a lot of wasted space. You do find these odd blank pages, and or blank panels or spaces, and I'm not sure if that was just a formatting issue, you know, editing issue. They weren't really sure what to put there. They didn't have anything to put there. Doesn't feel like there's really anything missing. But this covers everything from, you know, grenade launchers to flamethrowers to falling damage, which again, in the editorial kind of weirdness, is listed in the strength description, because there's a description of how to climb, and then you get into you know, different other kinds of damage later on. So there are missions in this book. There are like over 50 missions, but I should make it clear that missions in Recon were a little bit different than missions in other books. So they weren't really adventures per se. They were actually adventure seeds. So they were literally just 1 or 2 sentence descriptions of things you could do, and then the rest of that was meant to be fleshed out with all of these tables in the back that I showed you. So these tables have all kinds of random stuff. Now a lot of this is you know, attack resolution and stuff, but some of this is weather, terrain, animal encounters, civilian encounters, VC encounters. So there's all this. I guess what they were thinking is you would take these adventure seeds and then you would basically use the random tables to flesh everything out, which, while doable, seems like it would be a little bit of a drag if you were trying to do this on the fly. I can't imagine trying to do that on a spur of the moment. That having been said, each of the adventures is pretty different. You know, some of them are kidnappings, some of them are rescue missions, some of them are you know, Samaritan type of things. So there are, I think, 30-odd missions in the actual Vietnam part, and then there are like 19 mercenary missions. So overall, this is a complete system and a complete game. The system, the mechanics, I don't necessarily think were horribly innovative, even in their day, but they work well enough. As I said, it's a role-playing game, not a tactical game. There are some interesting kind of hand-wavy abstractions, especially for a military game. Movement. So you have a movement score based on your strength, but they do say, you know, unless your players are trying to do something really crazy, like 8 compound movements, don't worry too much about it. Just if it makes sense, roll with it to keep things moving along. And then the other abstraction that I find really interesting for a military game is in ammo. So if you have characters, they can keep track of their ammo manually, or they have a system that they say midway through the firefight, the mission director can just call an ammo check, and everybody has to make a check against their alertness, which again is going to be roll under on percentile dice without any modifiers. And if you fail your alertness check in the heat of battle, you have forgotten to reload your weapon, and then you have to sacrifice half of a combat round and then your next combat round, so you have only half as many rounds that you can fire. A lot of times in Recon you can fire multiple rounds based on the rate of fire of your weapon. I know I'm probably skipping over a lot here, but so that's the main rule book. The first interesting thing about Recon to me is that it is a military game that really just eschews many of the trappings of military games. Rank. There's no rank in here on the character sheet. And they say, well, basically these teams are kind of unconventional. You can play Army Rangers, you can play Navy SEALs, you can play long-range reconnaissance patrol, and then there are a lot of other type of teams you can play too. Some of them, like I said, will be mainly made up of Vietnamese people with a couple of American advisors. But basically, you know, man, I totally forgot where I was going with that. So hopefully I'll come back to it. Hopefully I'll remember it. Maybe I won't. Sorry. Like I said, I'm not really very good at this, I guess. So, but that's Recon in a nutshell. It's a military game. It eschews a lot of the tropes of the military, and it really is almost like a game that's designed to be easy to pick up and play. And there are a lot of places in there where they say, yeah, we do this for expediency. There are no maps in Recon. The terrain is meant to be randomly generated, and there's even a part in here where the author says, you know, if you're playing role-playing games, you probably have a map fetish. There aren't going to be maps in this game, so a lot of things you might expect out of a military game that you just don't see in Recon. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about with Recon, and I find, you know, how it's a military game that just defies a lot of the tropes, so it's kind of an interesting dichotomy in that way. And in another way, there's another dichotomy that's interesting but maybe not as fun to talk about, and that is that the game got some heat in its day for being racist. I'm just going to go ahead and come out and talk about the elephant in the room, because I understand completely why people get that impression. Let's talk about the enemy right here. VC, right? The second edition, the second printing of the rules, actually changed this to Charlie, which is probably only slightly less offensive. That's the only use of that term in the book. I'm going to go ahead and turn away from that now. But in one of the random tables for R&R, it uses the term broads. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. The game came out in 82. Something like that probably wouldn't fly today. I think that Recon was really trying to be true to its source material. I'm not trying to excuse that. You know, just because something is true doesn't mean that it's pleasant or that it's not ugly. And it's certainly unpleasant and ugly language. But I can kind of compartmentalize it. One, because it's not gratuitous. It's not used repeatedly over and over. Two, I do believe it's appropriate to the setting. It also wouldn't break my heart if they used different words. But you know, it is what it is. Now, as a counterpoint to that, I want to point out that the modules for the game, module number 1, Haiphong Halo, assumes that the players will be Vietnamese people because you are working behind enemy lines, and you cannot do that as an American. You need to avoid detection through either subterfuge or stealth. And then Hearts and Minds is also a module that has a lot to do with interacting with indigenous people. You will play indigenous people at times. I'll get into that more a little bit later. This module has a very respectful treatment of indigenous people, of the Vietnamese people, and the dedication is to the people of Vietnam who suffered and fought in the Vietnam War. I'm paraphrasing. I'm not trying to pull the, you know, hey, it's cool because Recon has a black friend here, but I think when you view it in totality, at least to me, it seems that the intent here was not malicious or bad. And again, I'm not excusing the language. Again, I can compartmentalize it and kind of grit my teeth and get over it. But there are people who are going to have feelings about some of the material in that rule book, and you know, I understand that. I mean, I get it. You know, we've come a long way. I hope not as far as we should have, but I don't want to get too far off topic. But I'm just saying that if you know, people have feelings about that, I get it. So the other dichotomy, or another dichotomy of this game, as far as I'm concerned, is that yes, it has both some crazy insensitive, to put it euphemistically, language, and then also some really almost reverent treatment of the Vietnamese people. So again, it's kind of two things at odds. So and then the third thing that I find really interesting about this game is that all these volumes are really, really slim. You know, this is, you know, it said 40 odd pages in the rule book. Module number 2, Haiphong Halo, is, let's see here, 43 pages, okay? And then, oh, I'm sorry, Hearts and Minds, module number 2. Module number 1 is Haiphong Halo. This thing only has about 7 or 8 pages, and it's weird how all the formatting is different for this thing. You got digest size, full size. Haiphong Halo is basically like a folded up newspaper. That's exactly what it is. I don't know, I'm kind of surprised that some of these still exist, honestly, because this is so not very well known. Forgive my little area for my webcam here. We have tables galore, more tables, right? And then a big map of a boat, which is kind of cool, multi-level map. You've got a map of the Haiphong Harbor. It's kind of hard to see, but you have the artillery stuff here, and then this is a map of the docks here where you're going to encounter some of these boats. Let's talk real... So everything in here, every module, Haiphong Halo is, as you can see, short, but it's just jam-packed with info on the different types of teams you can play. There are underwater encounters here. The first module is going to have you operating behind enemy lines around Haiphong Harbor. You can insert over land, by sea. You know, you might encounter different underwater creatures or wreckage that can be a danger, not to mention the danger of sneaking around during any of the various missions that you have here that can occur in the Haiphong Halo module. It's a pretty cool module. It's short, but for its size it has a lot of stuff. The second module for the game, I feel like I'm really rambling here, sorry. The second module for the game is a lot more conventional, even though it's still pretty unconventional. And I say it's a lot more conventional because it has a single mission and an overarching theme and timeline and goal. And Hearts and Minds is basically where the players are going to be a special forces team who goes into a mountain village, and they have to win the trust of the villagers, and then they have to help them to fortify. They have to train them, help them to fortify their village. Here's another one of those mortar grids. That's not encouraging. Right there is the village. You probably can't see that too well. And you're going to help them to build latrines and do stuff like that. There is a timeline, but this module is very unconventional. because it's still a lot of tables of random events that can occur. So there's a big introduction about the various villages in the mountain that played a part in the war. It explains that the tribe in this module is going to be kind of an amalgamation of different tribes, just for brevity's sake. And so you have all these things that you have to do, and then there are just tons of tables of events that can happen. I'll go into that a little bit more. You can, there are rules for generating the what they call montagnard, or the mountain people characters. They're much hardier than the player characters. What's so interesting about this module is, and again this kind of completely shatters the myth that this was a miniatures war game, is that everything in here is about role-playing. So there are combat events in this module, but by and large everything you do here is about role-playing. There are descriptions of over 50 villagers, or maybe it's right at 50, and they're not really long, but they basically are going to have the individual's name, kind of a nickname, which I think they're using as a mnemonic device here, and then 2 to 5 sentences about them, some personality quirk or some identifying motive or drive, and this is, I think, to kind of flesh this village out instead of having it just be random, really caveman stereotypes of some kind of tribe living in the mountains. So it's pretty neat, and it seems like it would go a long way towards fleshing out the events that follow. So you have all these events that you'll roll on a hundreds percentile die, and some of these are going to be training events, some of these are going to be accidents, some of them are going to be encounters in the woods, some of them will be things that occur, random events, between one of your characters and a villager. Like one of them is making mats, and they offer to help you. How you react to these is going to determine, and this isn't encoded into the rules, but they want the mission director to flesh this out, is going to determine how this tribe takes to you, and how whether or not you're accepted. Humor plays a big part in the world of this tribe. They warn that the player characters will be the butt of jokes, and that you should watch how they react to that. There are some VC harassment events, so those are on a table, and then has a sub-table. What's interesting too is there's a timeline, so you're assumed to be training the villagers, and then after a time training is over, but you're still rolling daily events. And so what they tell you to do is, if you roll a training event after the timeline has stipulated that you go past the training, this will then be a reminiscence where one of the characters will be like, oh hey, remember last week? One of the villagers might say, and you did that thing and you fell in the mud and we all laughed at you, or you helped that kid who scraped his knee, or whatever the situation might be. So, interesting module, really interesting approach, very different from anything I've really seen. If I have any criticisms of Hearts and Minds, and I'm really impressed with this overall, because I think there's just so much packed into here. If I could just backtrack for a second, I think that the descriptions of these villagers you could use in almost any game that has that element of encountering a different culture to kind of flesh that out. You could use it in a pulp game with kind of a Lost World scenario, or maybe a sci-fi game where you're encountering some kind of an alien community for the first time. But if I have any criticisms of this module, it is, one, there's no table of contents, and there's a lot of information in here, so I really think that would have been nice. All of the Recon stuff relative to his size is really, really dense with material. That's not to say it's dry, although this is a little bit, but there's so much in here. I like this game. It definitely has its faults, but I will say that as far as the bang for your buck, something like Hearts and Minds here, I think has more playable value than a lot of newer stuff that has over twice the page count and costs half as much. This usually goes for anywhere from 45 to, I've seen it for 75, but at 45 I would say this is a heck of a value. There's a lot of stuff in here. So when it comes to table of contents, if you are an aspiring RPG writer, or you are a writer and you're working on something, if you ever find yourself wondering, should I add a table of contents? Do I need this? I would encourage you to think about a table of contents the same way you think about personal lubricant. If you have to ask yourself whether you need it, you probably do. Especially with something like Recon, because there's so much in here, and every supplement that I've seen for this, and again, I've only got 4 of the 6 here, but every supplement I've seen is just a veritable clown car of usable content. It's just spilling out. So the other supplements that I don't have, one is the Sansuchi map pack, which I've never even seen actually, just seen pictures, and the other is Sayeret, the track commander, or Sayeret. So Sayeret I'll talk about for a minute because I've seen it, but I don't have it here. That one is the game of the Arab-Israeli War. It contains something called Track Commander, which was a tank operations during the Arab-Israeli War. Track Commander was included in Sayeret, but it was going to be its own separate module, its own separate supplement. They were actually going to cover armored combat after post-World War II. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but they decided there was too much material, so they just made it into Track Commander, added it to Sayeret, and they also added something called Roadkill, which is vehicle rules, whether it's motorcycles, trucks, how they handle crash damage, all that kind of stuff. Just another jam-packed supplement from these guys. In the introduction to Sayeret, Joe Martin, the designer, talks about how he intended Recon to be kind of a universal system of modern warfare, and for his purposes he defines modern as post-World War II. He said he felt like everything else, if I'm remembering correctly, had written that everything else was really heavily covered. So modern combat. Of course, this is modern as of 1982, although I'm not really too sure it'd be difficult to update Recon as written. As I said, there's not a ton of granularity in the weapon damage. Most weapons do damage in multiples of D10. Like a bayonet will do, I think, 4d10. If you're stabbing, there may be a different slashing number. And pretty much any weapon can kill you. There's a hit location chart. You can die instantly. Staying in cover goes a long way to making that less likely. And there's also a very thin line between life and death in Recon. When you get to 0 hit points, you're unconscious, and when you get below 0, you're dead, and that's it. Only medics can do any kind of field medicine, and field medicine only helps you but a little bit. So not really going to help you too much there. There were some other supplements that were announced. There was one called Headhunters Limited that was supposed to be just a straight mercenary modern game that didn't get released. I think RPG Incorporated went out of business, and they were talking about doing like a World War II, I think a World War II supplement at one point. I think I read that anyway in one of the supplements. But overall, that was my Recon video. It's super long. I can't blame you if you didn't watch. Plus, I'm really horrible at this and probably jumped around way too much. But again, the three I want to leave you with. Reasons why I think Recon is quite interesting. And one is, to just sum up, it's a military RPG that really isn't complicated. All the tables aside, and let me tell you, there are tables. So many tables. This thing has more tables than IKEA. And then some of them have sub-tables. So it's like, yo dog, I heard you like tables, so we put a table in your table. And speaking of tables, your table will look like it has hail damage from all the rolling you're going to be doing of dice. Tables everywhere. So if you like tables, Recon's a game for you. But aside from all the tables, it's really not that complicated. It is a game that does have some very insensitive language, but also does have a kind of much more nuanced portrayal of the Vietnamese than I've seen in a lot of games, and really a more nuanced portrayal of people that may or may not be enemies, or that are just sometimes bystanders or NPCs. This is really, of course I've seen a lot of modules that have NPCs with certain motivations, but just the sheer effort that was undertaken in something like Hearts and Minds to really craft a believable community for the characters to immerse themselves in. Oh yeah, going back to this real quick, so no table of contents. The only other probably criticism I would have of Hearts and Minds is there's really, spoiler alert, it doesn't feel like there's a final act. There are certainly some some combat events that can occur, but there's no kind of denouement. It doesn't feel like to me it would seem like after you get the village trained, there's an all-out assault, and you have to see if the training really has worked, etc. One more interesting thing too, and I know I'm jumping around, sorry about this module, is once you do get the villagers trained, you have to go out on patrol with them, and it's only going to be one American, and then the rest of the patrol will be villagers. So during these outings, one player will play their own character, and the rest of the players will actually play the part of the villagers. I think that's kind of a neat innovation. Also, these villagers are actually much sturdier on average than most of the player characters are likely to be. So it's kind of neat. So let's see, what did I cover so far? It's a military game, but it's not complicated. It's both insensitive and at times incredibly nuanced in its portrayal and respectful in its portrayal of the indigenous people of Vietnam. And then the last thing, which I didn't really put into words, is that it is made of these little teeny thin supplements, and each one is just bursting with info. Again, dollar for dollar, pound for pound, this is pretty much wall-to-wall playable content. Some of it is fluff, but not much. So overall, bang for the buck, really high. Well, that's it for Recon. I wish I had the other pieces, but I don't. I appreciate you sticking with me. I'm sure the video quality, sound quality, and presentation have all been complete ass, so thanks for sticking it out. Take care. Fuck communism. Play Recon. I'm out.